Yahweh is arguably the most important figure in the Hebrew Bible, and even today he is the most important theological figure in the Abrahamic faiths. But the origin of Yahweh, where this deity came from, and when Yahweh worship first began are all matters of dispute. While scholars are still debating how Yahweh worship first came to be, it is clear that Yahweh came from a world of Near Eastern gods. It is a fact that Yahweh was unique to Israel, as he is not found in Ugaritic or Phoenician pantheons. But there are many questions as to how he became the God of the Israelites and where he came from, such as if the Israelites seemingly did not worship Yahweh at first, who did? The name Israel implies that the early Israelites worshipped El, not Yahweh. There are some scholars who hypothesize that Yahweh was brought to Israel by the Shasu nomads who were active around the southern Transjordan, specifically Edom. This scenario is plausible because it would explain why the Israelites are named after the god El and why Yahweh is absent from late Bronze Age Palestine. Another theory that has been put forth by scholars such as Mark S. Smith is that Yahweh was originally a cultic name for El in the south. This theory can be supported because it explains why Yahweh is associated with places like Sinai, Edom, and Midian. Genesis portrays the Israelites and Midianites with kinship relations. In Exodus, Yahweh first reveals himself to Moses in Midian after Moses marries a Midianite woman. It is in the Midian mountains where Yahweh orders Moses to return to Egypt and lead the Israelites to freedom. While Exodus is largely legendary, this passage seems to indicate a connection between Yahweh and the more southern regions like Midian. The Song of Deborah from the book of Judges also connects Yahweh with the various southern regions such as Edom, Mount Sinai, and Mount Seir. It is also important to look at two of the authors or groups of authors from the documentary hypothesis, the E and J authors, or Elohist and Yahwist authors. The reason why these respective authors are given these names is quite clear. The E source uses El, Elyon, and other El epithets to refer to God, while the J source uses Yahweh to refer to God. The E source likely comes from the northern kingdom of Israel, while the J source likely comes from the kingdom of Judah. This would be consistent with the theory that Yahweh comes from various southern regions. The linguistic evidence for the E source, the fact that Israel is named after El, and the fact that El is portrayed as superior to Yahweh in Deuteronomy 32 verses 8 to 9 shows that the traditions involving the early Israelites' worship of El made it into the E source portion of the Hebrew Bible. In other words, the linguistic or textual evidence shows that the God being referred to in the E source is the Canaanite El. In addition, the El of the Ugaritic text closely resembles the god El Elyon in Genesis. In Ugaritic myths, El is the king of the gods, creator of the universe, and creator of all creatures, kind and compassionate. This sounds very much like the God of Genesis and many other books in the Hebrew Bible. The God of the J source, Yahweh, may have entered into the Israelite religion through trade between the Israelites and Edomites or Midianites. While the idea of Yahweh being a southern epithet for El has some arguments to support it, there are some issues with applying it to the earliest Israelites. One would think that Yahweh would have most, if not all, the attributes of El in the J source and other early biblical literature. While Yahweh does have more benevolent creator deity attributes in other books in the Hebrew Bible, these are later texts. In the earliest biblical literature, such as the Song of Deborah, Yahweh is portrayed as a warrior storm god. The Song of Deborah is perhaps the oldest piece of biblical literature, and Yahweh's role in the song is interesting. The text states, O Yahweh, when you went out from Seir, when you marched from the country of Edom, the earth quaked, the sky poured, the clouds burst, and the mountains shook, in the presence of Yahweh God of Sinai. Yahweh in this poem or song is said to cause rain, clouds burst, and earthquakes. This sounds very much like a Near Eastern storm god, no different than gods such as Baal. In fact, during the period of Judges, the cults of Yahweh and Baal could have competed against each other. In the Song of Deborah, Yahweh is also given credit for the Israelite victory in battle, which adds to his role as a warrior god. In later texts, such as the Book of Jonah, Yahweh is also portrayed with the attributes of a storm god. The text states, Yahweh sent a violent wind over the sea. The storm was so powerful that the ship was in danger of breaking up. Even in a text from after the Babylonian exile, such as Jonah, Yahweh is still portrayed as a storm god. Texts such as the Book of Jonah and early biblical texts portraying Yahweh as this type of deity are the reason why Yahweh, originally being a southern cult name for specifically El, may not have been the case early on. If Yahweh's portrayals as a storm warrior god are taken into account, it looks like Yahweh has a similar position to Baal in relation to El. It is not far-fetched to suggest that in the early Israelites' version of the Canaanite pantheon, El was still the king of the gods, while Yahweh and Baal would have been subordinate to El as respective powerful storm gods. It seems possible that this was the case in other Canaanite-descended cultures such as Moab. Eventually, Yahweh is given attributes that are associated with El and is eventually conflated with him. Some of the features of El that Yahweh is given include the features of an aged, wise God and the position of being the head of a divine council. Specifically, with the divine council, oftentimes Yahweh is said to be the head or king of the heavenly hosts. Yahweh, as mentioned before, is given El's quality of being a kind, compassionate God. Yahweh is specifically described as a merciful and gracious God. The E&P sources recognize this contradiction between the storm warrior Yahweh and benevolent El, and attempted to explain this by emphasizing that El and Yahweh were the same God. The P narrative states that Yahweh first revealed his name to Moses, but the patriarchs knew him by El epithets. Because Yahweh is given attributes of El and eventually conflated with him, while maintaining the storm warrior god characteristics, the theory of Yahweh originally being a storm war god from the south and being brought to the Israelite highlands through trade with the Edomites and Midianites seems to be the best explanation. It would be unlikely that the highland Israelites would develop in a vacuum and not interact with other Iron Age Canaanite groups, and there is good reason to suggest that the Israelites had contact with groups such as the Midianites. After being a part of the Israelite pantheon for some time, Yahweh is combined with El. It explains why Yahweh started out as a storm god who was subordinate to El, why Yahweh was not a part of the original Canaanite pantheon, and why Yahweh has associations with the south. Within the context of El and Yahweh being eventually seen as the same god, there is an interesting piece of archaeological evidence at Kuntalet Arjud. A graffiti drawing on a storage jar seems to depict a crowned Yahweh standing next to the goddess Asherah. There is an inscription that goes along with it, which mentions Yahweh of Samaria and his Asherah. The phrase his Asherah likely indicates that the goddess Asherah is Yahweh's consort or wife. This is more evidence that Yahweh took the role that El had in the Israelite religion, because Asherah was originally El's consort. But there is something else important about this drawing, and that is the fact that Yahweh is actually depicted with the physical appearance. This storage jar drawing might be the first piece of archaeological evidence from Palestine that demonstrates Yahweh had a physical appearance. He is shown with a crown, a beard, and a male body. Modern-day Jews and Muslims believe that their God, Yahweh, does not have a physical appearance. But it turns out that he was depicted with a physical body during the era of the two kingdoms and earlier. Something else to consider is that if Yahweh is similar to other Canaanite deities such as El and Baal, it is not a stretch at all to say, like those two deities, Yahweh was depicted with a physical body. El and Baal had physical appearances in their Ugaritic and Canaanite artistic depictions, so it would make sense that Yahweh would too. Not only is there archaeological evidence, but there is textual evidence from the Bible that demonstrates that Yahweh once had a physical appearance. In the book of Samuel, it says, "And Yahweh came and stood there and called as time and time before, Shemuel, Shemuel." When the text says that Yahweh came and stood there, that implies that Yahweh had a physical body and was physically standing in front of where Samuel was lying down. This would be consistent with how Yahweh was depicted in the drawing on the storage jar and as a physical being standing. Samuel chapter 3 verse 10 is not the only piece of textual evidence that shows Yahweh had a physical body. In Exodus 24 verse 10, Moses, Aaron, Nadab, and Abihu, along with 70 Israelite elders, went up to Mount Sinai and saw Yahweh himself. The text states, "And they saw the God of Israel. Under his feet there was something like a pavement of sapphire stone, like the very heaven for clearness." Scholar William Schneiderwind argues that the elders actually see God or Yahweh. In order for the Israelites to see the God of Israel, or Yahweh, he has to have a physical appearance. Not only do they see him, the text describes his feet and how there was a sapphire stone at his feet. In Isaiah 63, verses 1 to 6, a lookout in Jerusalem sees Yahweh returning from battle against the Edomites, and the lookout notices that the God of the Israelites is stained in blood. Isaiah also sees Yahweh enthroned in the inner sanctum of the first temple. In Genesis, Yahweh is seen strolling in the Garden of Eden, which is reminiscent of the Sumerian god Enlil taking a stroll along the river bank, and the Canaanite god El strolling along the seashore. Even in later texts, such as Ezekiel, indicates a physical appearance of the God of the Israelites. Ezekiel describes a human-like figure, Yahweh, sitting on a throne of lapis lazuli. The concept of Yahweh being an immaterial, omniscient being was a much later development. When looking at the evidence for the early history of God, or Yahweh, it is important to keep in mind that not only was he a storm war god from the southern regions, but he also had a physical appearance for a good portion of his existence.